Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. So today we're going to be looking at Talking from 9 to 5 by Deborah Tannen. And we've got some really interesting audio clips from that book to share with you. And I think you guys are going to find some of this stuff pretty surprising. Basically, what we're going to be looking at is how the ways we learn to talk as kids really
Yeah.
have a huge impact on us at work,
Mhm.
especially when it comes to men and women and how they deal with things like authority and getting recognition for their work. And just to give you a little taste of what we're talking about, one of the things Tannen talks about is how women are sometimes mistaken for secretaries, even when it's pretty obvious that they're not, like if they have a corner office with their title on the door, that kind of thing. And she also points out how a lot of the language we use to talk about leadership, like stick to your guns or calling the shots, uses metaphors that come from these really male-dominated worlds like sports or the military. So it kind of makes you wonder if women are even playing the same game sometimes.
Yeah, and it's not just about playing the same game. It's about recognizing that sometimes the rules themselves can be kind of stacked against women. Like all these expectations we have about how women should act. They create this extra hurdle for women to jump over. It's not enough to just do the job well. They also have to constantly fight against these assumptions people make about them and really work hard to prove that they deserve to be in charge, which is something that most men don't have to deal with nearly as much.
Right. It's like there's this invisible script that everyone's following. And if you don't know the lines, you're automatically at a disadvantage. And it's not always about some kind of blatant sexism either. Tannen gives this example of a woman who was boarding a flight, and when she gave her title as doctor, the travel agent just assumed she was a secretary, traveling with her boss who was the real doctor. It's kind of mind-blowing how ingrained these stereotypes are.
Yeah, it really shows how powerful these things we call linguistic styles can be, which is basically just a fancy way of saying the way we use language to communicate. And this includes things like our tone of voice, how direct we are, whether we use humor, all that stuff. And the interesting thing is that all these styles are shaped by so many different factors, like our gender, our cultural background, even the way we were raised. So in that example with a travel agent, it's likely that they already had this picture in their mind of what a doctor sounds and acts like. And this woman on the phone just didn't fit that image.
It really makes you think about how often we might be misjudging people or making assumptions about them based on these unconscious biases without even realizing it. So how does all this linguistic style stuff actually play out when it comes to being a leader at work?
Well, one of the areas where this becomes really clear is in how we give and receive feedback. Tannen found that women who are in leadership positions are often much more likely to soften criticism, to try to protect the feelings of the people who work for them. And while this can definitely create a more supportive environment, it can also backfire sometimes because it can be misinterpreted as a sign of weakness or that the woman isn't really in charge.
Right, so it's like this balancing act where women leaders have to be assertive and make tough decisions, but also be compassionate and care about their team. No wonder it feels like so much pressure. Tannen actually talks about this one woman surgeon who literally had to change the way she communicated just to get the nurses to cooperate with her. It just seems crazy that someone with her level of expertise would have to adjust how she talks just to be heard.
It all comes back to those deeply ingrained societal expectations we were talking about earlier. Like with men, if they're in a leadership position, they're often expected to be direct and tell people what to do, even if it comes across as a bit harsh. And a lot of times, that's actually seen as a good thing, like a sign of strength. But when women do the same thing and act in that same direct way, they're in the risk of being labeled as bossy or aggressive. It's a classic double standard that women have to navigate all the time.
It really feels like women are constantly being judged, not just on what they say, but on how they say it. Almost like they have to be mind readers and figure out how their words are going to be perceived, and then adjust accordingly. Is there even a way out of this double bind?
Well, it's not about having all the answers, but it's more about raising awareness and making sure everyone is communicating openly. One of the things that Tannen suggests is that women should be more mindful of the language they use, especially when it comes to talking about their accomplishments.
Wait, so you mean like bragging? Because I know a lot of women, myself included, who feel really uncomfortable doing that.
It's not really about bragging. It's more about owning your successes
Mm-hmm.
and presenting them in a way that's going to resonate with the people you're talking to. For example, instead of downplaying your role in a successful project, you could try highlighting the specific skills and strategies you used to get the results you did.
So, like, instead of saying, oh, it was a team effort, I just did my part, you could say something like, I used my project management skills to effectively coordinate the team. and we were able to deliver the project on time and under budget. So even that subtle shift in how you talk about it can make a big difference in how people see your contributions.
Exactly. And it's not about trying to change who you are. It's more about learning how to be strategic in how you present yourself and your accomplishments,
Hmm.
and understanding how language can be used to achieve your goals.
And it's interesting because, we were just talking about how women often downplay their accomplishments. But Tannen actually connects this back to how girls are raised, like from when they're little kids.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating to see how these patterns start so early on. There's all this research showing that girls are often praised for being helpful and cooperative, while boys are more often encouraged to be assertive and take charge.
So it's like from a young age, girls are getting this message that it's not okay to stand out or to really claim their achievements. It's no wonder so many women have trouble promoting themselves later in life. But, is there any way to break free from these ingrained patterns?
Well, I think awareness is a huge first step. Once we understand where these behaviors come from, we can start to challenge them and make different choices. And Tannen gives this great example of a woman named Eve who completely transforms her boss's image.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more about Eve.
So basically, Eve comes in and takes control of her boss's communication, like all of it. She insists on formality, emphasizes his accomplishments, even makes people schedule appointments instead of just barging in. It's like a master class in strategically manipulating how people perceive authority.
Wow, that's brilliant. So she basically created this whole new linguistic style for her boss, one that commanded respect and made him seem really authoritative.
Exactly. And the crazy thing is, it worked. Her boss ended up getting more recognition, got promoted, the whole 9 yards. It shows how you can actually use these communication dynamics to your advantage.
So it's not about changing who you are, but it's more about understanding the rules of the game, right? And then playing it strategically. It's almost like learning a whole new language, like the language of power.
Precisely. And, speaking of different languages, Tan also talks about how cultural differences can play a huge role in communication styles at work.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading something about that in the book. Didn't she talk about how American mothers communicate differently with their kids compared to, say, Samoan mothers?
That's right. American moms tend to downplay their authority. They'll use baby talk and finish their kids' sentences, and they'll often give all the credit to their kids, even if they helped a lot. But in Samoa, mothers are seen as these strong authority figures, and the way they communicate reflects that.
That's such a huge difference. So even the way we communicate authority to our own kids is really shaped by our culture.
Exactly. And these cultural differences can have a big impact in the workplace,
Yeah.
especially in global companies where you have people from all different backgrounds working together.
Yeah, it makes you realize that effective communication is about so much more than just the words we use. It's about understanding these unspoken rules, the cultural nuances, and the subtle ways we signal things like authority and respect.
And this is where things can get really tricky, especially for women in leadership positions, because they're not only dealing with these cultural differences, but they're also battling against all those gender stereotypes we talked about earlier.
It's like they're walking this tightrope, constantly adjusting their balance to avoid being seen as too assertive or too passive.
Exactly. And this is where Tannen brings in this concept of ritual opposition. She explains that in a lot of cultures, men are expected to engage in this kind of playful banter, even if it means putting each other down sometimes.
Oh, you mean like those guys who are always teasing each other and giving each other a hard time?
Exactly. It's seen as a way of bonding and establishing a pecking order. But women are often left out of these rituals, or if they do participate, they get penalized for it.
So it's like if a woman tries to join in on the banter, she risks coming across as aggressive or unfeminine. But if she stays silent, she might be perceived as aloof or standoffish. It's like a no-win situation.
It really highlights how important it is to understand these cultural nuances
Right.
and to find ways to communicate effectively without having to compromise who you are.
So what can women do to navigate these complex communication dynamics? Is it about trying to adopt a more masculine style or trying to fit into these male-dominated rituals?
Not at all. It's about being aware of the different communication styles that are at play and finding ways to leverage your own strengths and your own unique communication style.
So it's about finding your own voice and using it effectively,
Right.
even if it means breaking some of those unwritten rules sometime.
Exactly. And it's about working to create a workplace culture that values diverse communication styles and recognizes the contributions of everyone, regardless of their gender or cultural background.
That sounds amazing, but it also sounds like a pretty tall order. Like, how do we even start to shift these deeply ingrained patterns?
Well, it starts with awareness and having open and honest conversations about these issues. We need to be willing to challenge our own assumptions.
And that includes men being aware of their own communication styles, right? And how they might be impacting women in the workplace.
Absolutely. Men have a huge role to play in creating more inclusive and equitable work environment.
This is all so fascinating, but it's also a lot to take in. I'm curious, how does all of this play out in more specific situations, like, say, performance reviews or salary negotiations? Those feel like really high-stakes scenarios where communication can make or break your career. Those are definitely situations where communication can make all the difference. So, like, how can we use all this knowledge about different communication styles and how men and women communicate differently to be better at those kinds of things?
Well, for performance reviews, one of the big things that Tannen talks about is the importance of being really specific and data-driven when you're talking about what you've accomplished.
So, like, instead of just saying, I worked really hard on this project, you should be ready to give some actual numbers and examples to back that up.
Exactly. Highlight those specific results you achieved, the challenges you overcame, and the positive impact your work had on the team or even the whole organization.
It's almost like you're building a case for yourself, presenting a clear and compelling argument for why you deserve that raise or promotion.
Exactly. And again, it's not about bragging. It's about owning those successes and presenting them in a way that's going to make sense to the people who are making those decisions.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about receiving feedback? Like, how can women make sure they're not being judged unfairly based on their communication style?
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
Tannen suggests that women should be more aware of how their words might be interpreted, especially when it comes to giving and receiving criticism.
So, like, if a woman manager is giving feedback in a more indirect way, because she doesn't want to hurt someone's feelings, she should be ready to explain why she's doing that and make sure that her message is coming across clearly.
Exactly. And it's also important for women to realize that being direct isn't the only way to be assertive. You can be firm and stand your ground without having to be aggressive or confrontational.
So it's all about finding that balance, right? Between being direct, but also being respectful and not letting people walk all over you.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that different cultures have different ideas about directness and how to give feedback. So if you're working in a global company, you really need to be sensitive to those cultural differences.
It seems like so much of this just comes down to awareness, not just of our own communication style, but also of the styles of the people around us. It's almost like we need to become communication detectives,
Mhm.
constantly observing and analyzing those subtle cues and signals that are shaping our interactions.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
And it's not just about being aware, it's also about being proactive. Like, what can companies do to create a workplace culture where everyone feels heard and respected?
Right. What are some concrete things that organizations can do to make that happen?
Well, one really important thing is to provide training and development opportunities that focus on communication skills, especially for women and people from underrepresented groups.
So not just those general diversity workshops, but programs that really get into the specific communication challenges that women face at work.
Exactly. And those programs should not only teach people how to communicate effectively, but they should also help people learn how to recognize and challenge unconscious bias.
It's about creating a culture where people feel comfortable speaking up, sharing their perspectives, and challenging the status quo.
And it's about creating systems and processes that support different communication styles. Like, some companies are now experimenting with different ways of doing performance reviews that take into account all those nuances of gender and cultural differences in communication.
It's exciting to see those kinds of changes happening. It feels like we're finally starting to understand how important communication is for success, not just for individuals, but for organizations as a whole.
And it's not just about success. It's about creating a work environment where everyone feels valued, respected, and like they can really contribute their best work.
That's a great point. So as we're wrapping up our deep dive into talking from 9 to 5, what are some key takeaways that you hope our listeners will remember?
Well, first and foremost, remember that communication is about so much more than just the words you say. It's about your tone of voice, your body language, and all that unspoken stuff. And all of that happens within a specific cultural context. Second, be aware of how men and women might communicate differently and how people from different cultures might communicate differently. And think about how those differences could be affecting your interactions with people. And finally, be proactive. Work on developing your own communication skills and create a workplace culture that welcomes and values different perspectives and communication styles.
Those are some really great points. And to all our listeners out there, I'd encourage you to think about your own experiences in the workplace. Have you ever felt misunderstood or misjudged because of how you communicate? What can you do to communicate more effectively and make sure your voice is heard? We hope this deep dive has given you some things to think about, and maybe even some tools you can use to navigate the complex world of communication at work. Just remember, communication is a skill that can be learned and improved upon. And with a little bit of effort, we can all become better communicators and create a more inclusive and equitable workplace for everyone. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time for another fascinating exploration of the ideas that shape our world.